Bring in our next guest to talk about NVIDIA in the chip sector. Vivek Arya, Bank of America Securities Senior Semiconductors Analyst. And when you look at NVIDIA, it's good to see you, Vivek. When you look at it, I think there's two angles. One is how strong are its customers? How strong is demand going to be? And then you've got, I guess, competitors to NVIDIA that want to get into the same business. And on both of those metrics, I think you think NVIDIA is well positioned. They're still the leader, and demand is still going to be strong.
Yeah, good morning, Joe. I think the key is that their customers are in a race to re-architect the data center and replace traditional servers with accelerated servers. This movement had started about a year or two ago, and then as soon as we started to see the improvements in generative AI and these large language models, which, by the way, the computing requirements to train some of these models are growing 4 to 5 times a year. So this is not your, Moore's law progressing every 2 years. This is technology that is changing every, is 4 to 5 times a year. So we need to throw a ton of computing infrastructure, and it is not just the processors, it is networking, it is optics, it is software, it is developers, it is bringing it all together. And in our mind, there is only one company that can bring it all together. This is expensive, no doubt. We are going from capital intensity for a lot of these cloud players that used to be 9 or 10%, and now it's 15 or 16%, right? CapEx is growing 50+% a year. But we do think that this is very important for them. It can open up new revenue opportunities, and this build out and re-architecting can last at least through the next decade, with a 4 or 5 year of initial build out and then a lot more success-based build out. And then finally, yes, there is competition, but we do expect NVIDIA to maintain its 80 to 85% market share, and then another 10% or so for these custom chips, and then a few percent for other players such as AMD.
You refer to it as a generational opportunity, and that I guess that's 10 years. That'll continue. There's some industry events you point to. Taiwan's semis results. AMD had an AI event. All these things. So you're saying that all Avago, Micron, all these things indicate that's demand for NVIDIA's Blackwell chips?
Yeah, I think we have a few things that are coming together. First of all, the customers themselves are being pushed by this private company, OpenAI, on one side, that is innovating rapidly in a very kind of closed and proprietary architecture. And on the other hand, you have a company such as Meta that is putting out large language models in a very open format, right? Anyone can go and access their models. So the traditional cloud players are having to take the lead from these two very important forces. And this is not just a US phenomena, right? We are seeing this spread across the world, where every country, every region wants to be involved in setting up their large language model. NVIDIA is in India this week, for example, and there's a lot of large language models that are being trained in Indian languages, right, for that culture. There are large language models that are being trained for all the languages and culture of the Middle East. So I think this is a global phenomena. Enterprises are jumping on board. Novo Nordisk is deploying a supercomputer, using NVIDIA's help. So it's a global phenomena. But as I mentioned, that in order to be successful in this, you can't just be successful in semiconductors, right? You have to be successful in the underlying systems integration technology, in networking and optics and software and developers. And the other important part of what you mentioned is you need scale. You need to be able to work very well with the supply chain, because this is not going to take just one player. It's going to take many different players coming together and putting out this technology with a lot of reliability. That's the only way, I think, to scale it across this broad base of cloud and enterprise and sovereign entities.
But Blackwell's fixed. That didn't take long, right? And you expect the yield to get better. What does that mean? The yield will get better for Blackwell?
Yeah, initially when they put the Blackwell product out, there was an issue in just the underlying semiconductor wafer. So they have fixed that. And we are now expecting Blackwell to go from almost nothing to, at least $3 to $4 billion in their next quarter, going on to 10 to 15 and then to $20+ billion over the next several quarters. It is an extremely complex product. It's not just their product. We need to see a lot of other improvements in the data center, such as liquid cooling. So you have, sort of the whole village coming together in making this successful, because without making this successful, you're not going to have the scaling of a lot of these large language models. You're not going to be able to really justify their speed or accuracy. And it's a virtuous cycle. Every time NVIDIA comes out with a better product, you have the software community, the internet community, the cloud community, the enterprises coming out with applications that can take better advantage of it. And it goes back and forth. And we think the cycle can last for several years. And the one other point I would also want to make in terms of the stock itself, yes, it has had a remarkable run, but when we look at its earnings growth for next year that we forecast to be in the range of 40 to 50%, it is still trading less than 1 times that earnings growth. And if you look at the broader market, it's trading at 2 times the earnings growth. If you look at the other Max 7, they're also trading 1.5 to 2 times their earnings growth. So from that metric, we do think the stock is still compelling at these levels.
But we do have big news regarding one of the Mag 7 stocks, and it is that Brin has bought more NVIDIA, which I thought was pretty interesting, considering the stock has been up a lot. It's right on the heels here of Apple with market cap. Why'd you buy more here?
Yeah, so next week, we know, which we're going to get into, we have the Oscars of earnings with all of the big names that we talk about. And I think that, how do you play that trade? I own NVIDIA, I've owned it for a long time, and I think the stock technically looks like it's breaking out. It had been consolidating for the past couple months, but I feel really confident Microsoft, Apple, via OpenAI, Meta, Google, Amazon are all going to be talking about what? Their AI initiatives. And so I think next week we'll have some winners and losers, some disappointments, but I think all roads once again lead to NVIDIA, and you're going to continue to see huge CapEx spends from these companies as they're all individually looking to monetize their own endeavors into AI. And I still think NVIDIA is in pole position to benefit from all of that CapEx spend. So I took the opportunity to add to it yesterday.
Yeah, it's in the midst of pretty good momentum. It's up 18% month to date. It's been up 28% in some 3 months. As I said, it's barely off of its record high. The others have a little bit more to go. So unafraid, I find Brin to, even after that kind of momentum, to buy it here rather than wait for a pullback, which hasn't been out of the question for this stock over a period of time.
Yeah, well, I mean, the way I've been playing the stock is, I have sold calls against it. So when the stock sold down, I closed those call positions. So just owning the stock. And so I'm like taking advantage of the volatility. And I think that's a good thing to do with a lot of these names like an NVIDIA or a Tesla. But I just still see, when I'm looking at Apple or Microsoft's, earnings and revenue growth really aren't that strong. Is part of that because of all of the CapEx, especially Microsoft is going to be doing. And I just think NVIDIA is going to be the recipient. We won't get their numbers till the end of the month. And so I just think it's a good opportunity where next week is going to be a buy NVIDIA. And I think that's going to be a consistent story from all of these companies who are spending billions of dollars on Blackwell, on H100s, H200s.
Josh, it's a top 2 position, I think, for you. We're going to have to wait until November 20th for earnings, so we got a minute to wait there. What's your read here? What's your take on Brin buying more up here?
Well, I always root for Brin, but I would just say we know AI spending has been and should continue to be explosive. The question is, how much is already baked into the expectations for the stock? You're talking about a company that out of the last 5 years has had a triple-digit return, stock return, in 4 of those 5 years. You're basically talking about a company that over the last year has grown its earnings per share by 415%. It's grown its sales by 195%. And investors have gotten accustomed to that kind of eye-bulging, eye-popping growth. And it's just hard for me to understand where that's going to come from. We already have the expectations based on all of the other Mag 7 names and the hyperscalers that are going to be doing this sort of investing. We know that. We also know that there has been a global push for companies to experiment with AI, incorporate AI, et cetera. So who's left? Is Jupiter and Mars going to start contributing here to the forward guidance? So that's the risk. I don't necessarily think that it has to be feast or famine. There's a universe in which NVIDIA reports great numbers. The stock doesn't rally, but doesn't get killed either. It's just a massive company with already embedded huge expectations, and the gains of the past are unlikely to be repeated from here. Doesn't mean there's not another 10% or another 15%. I just think it gets harder from these levels, and I'm saying this as a long. So I'm
hear
in
you.
the name.
That's what. No, you're big in the name. That's why I went to you next. But Weiss, you're in the name.
Yep.
Is there more near-term risk in this name now, given the run that it's had, as I said, the timing of Bryn buying it here? Just give me the way that you would observe, doing this now.
Well, just mathematically, when you're coming up to an event that's catalyst for the upside and the downside, given the performance you cited, there is more risk. But that's short-term risk. And Bryn buying it now, I'm sure that regardless of what happens this quarter, if you look out a few months, she's going to be happy she did. So it's always difficult to pick the timing on buying a name or adding to it, and she's adding to it. Haven't been there for a long time. So clearly right now they are in the sweet spot. And clearly they can't meet the demand that they're seeing from customers and want-to-be customers. So it's a great thing to do. And as I mentioned, I think a few weeks ago, the fact that Jensen Huang has been so visible and talking about demand, he's got to deliver. And him not be anything but a foolish person, I believe he knows it's going to be a great quarter. Now, what the whisper numbers get to be when numbers move like this, who knows, but who cares?
Bryn
That's
sort
a moment in time.
Makes the point, too. I mean, the factor of momentum is a very, very powerful. It's a very powerful thing.
But I'd also say that Taiwan Semi is the direct, perhaps the most direct beneficiary of the strength in NVIDIA. And they announced on their Phoenix fab, right, that yields are 4% better than their Taiwan fab. So that is powerful. That stock's had a good move, but I still think it's going to have a great move. Over a 4-year time period, if you look out for 23 to 26 forward earnings, they'll have doubled revenues, right? They'll have doubled earnings. I mean, that's tremendous performance. Not quite NVIDIA-like, but I also think it's much more sustainable.
Why is there a willingness, Jim, to get into a name even after a run like this? Because when you look at, as we get ready for mega cap earnings next week, the bulk of earnings growth in Q3 is going to come from tech and comm services. Now, the mega caps need to deliver. The bar is high. But when you look at the earnings growth expectations, as I say, tech and comm services are expected to lead the way. Tech up 15.2% earnings growth in Q3. Comm services up 13.5% in Q3. You take those out, and where do you get earnings growth out of the rest of the S&P 500? Down 0.2. So this is the show. It will continue to be the show, and there is no trepidation from Bryn buying a name like NVIDIA 3 weeks or so, 3-4 weeks ahead of its number.
Just on the NVIDIA, before we get to the earnings, you covered the momentum. Josh and Bryn covered the fundamentals. There's one other aspect that I think we need to cover, which is the seasonality. When you have this big a year, anyone who's behind their benchmark is going to play panic time to catch up. And how do you do that? You throw money at the winners like NVIDIA. It is likely in the next couple of months to go higher along with the market, because that's the easiest way for professional money managers who are behind to simply catch up. And also, by the way, a retail investor isn't going to want to sell this. I advise retail investors. I wouldn't tell them to take capital gains right now. So there's a lot of reasons I think Bryn is right.
We start off with NVIDIA's record run this week. The AI darling stock ending the day just short of all-time highs, up more than 16% this month. The chipmaker also briefly topping Apple in market cap today. The world's two most valuable companies neck and neck ahead of a big week for the tech trade. Most of the Mag 7 stocks gearing up to deliver results. Alphabet, Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, and Apple all on deck. So will next week be the moment of truth for big tech and the AI trade? Can the reports feel even more upside ahead? And I guess people will say, what are they going to spend? And is it going to prove that NVIDIA's market cap, NVIDIA's PE is worth it, Tim?
Well, that is the question, and I think we've talked about that a lighter capex load might actually be something to rally the mega caps on, because I just think that at times, especially we know with Meta that the year of efficiency led to a lot of gains. People have been concerned. I think with Google, who's going to report on Tuesday, I mean, there's a dynamic here that I think there is some need to see some follow through here. I think ultimately, as we go into this period, if you look at the NASDAQ 100 or the triple Qs and the Mag 7, obviously outside of Tesla, which has been on a tear, have not made new highs going all the way back to July, whereas semis have retaken some leadership. If you look at that period from September 9th, or there's been a couple different periods I think the market has used to both rotate out of growth back into value and this and that. But from September 9th or shortly after we got that payroll number and some reaffirmation of the consumer and the economy, you actually saw the growth come back in the semiconductors and that leadership. They've outperformed the S&P by almost 7% just since September 7th. And will they make new highs? We haven't made new highs on semis also since July. But I get the sense that's where we are. And I think everything we're going to hear from the hyperscalers is that this is a very important part of, again, that prisoner's dilemma. They got to be there.
Yeah. Bonawyn?
Yeah, so it just seems like that move that NVIDIA had over the past 2 weeks, 3 weeks has been pretty incredible. You had a pretty substantial pullback. We had last quarter, we had concerns about the Blackwell chip supply and demand kind of balance. Would they be able to meet demand? Would that lead to a pullback in revenue? Had we pulled revenue expectations too far forward? And we've kind of reversed and approaching, what seems to be us asking the same question again, which is, will the CapEx spend be there to kind of support the multiple and the revenue expectations? I would imagine that the other hyperscalers are continuing to spin because, as Tim said, it does seem somewhat of a situation where you have to continue to spin, you have to be in the game. This is essentially what all of these are leaning on in terms of margin expansion and supporting the multiples that they have now gotten. I'm not sure if next week necessarily is going to be the quote-unquote moment of truth, only because I think for some of them, Google, for example, Amazon, for another example, I think some of the expectations of the multiples reflect that expectations have pulled back a bit. So I do think, from one Mag 7 player to the other, the expectations and the earnings multiple reflect that perhaps there is an opportunity to trade here ahead of earnings.
I guess when we were thinking about what we were going to talk about on the show today, we thought,
and we think long and hard.
We actually do. We have planning meetings. We talk about this long,
the healthy
for a long
debate.
time.
We've been meeting since Wednesday to talk about the show.
It's a healthy.
Trying to have a healthy discussion.
I think the big question here with big tech earnings is, does it confirm the overarching thesis that has been driving the tech trade, and that is the robustness of the AI trade, right? And so to that end, Grasso, can we separate it? Can we separate what Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft are going to say from NVIDIA's performance, or are they inextricably intertwined?
Well, they're all clients of NVIDIA.
Right.
So that's a good spot to be in. NVIDIA is still 80 to 85% of the market. NVIDIA is the one that's actually getting revenue now, not sometime in the future. Can you separate them? Sure, you have done that. NVIDIA's up 200%, 185%, 186%. The rest of them are not. So we have separated them already. But wouldn't you say this is somewhat priced to perfection? And I've been positive on the market. I've been positive on NVIDIA. I missed NVIDIA. I got too cute around that 110 level. Thought it was going to come back in. That ship has sailed. I'm going to wait until we do a markets in turmoil special, probably to buy the next leg of NVIDIA for me.
Don't
right
be
now.
Cheeky, Grasso.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
It's
true, right?
Time to buy.
So when you really think about it, though, what do we have? The bar's been lowered for earnings. I think most of these companies can step over them. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the year-to-date performance on most of them, I think they need a breather.
All right. Let's say, Mike, that a lot of these hyperscalers say, we're not going to spend as much. We don't anticipate the spend to be at the same pace as we have been spending of late. What happens to this trade, Mike? Is it a positive, as Tim posits, or is it a negative overall?
A positive for the hyperscalers, if you're talking about Amazon, Microsoft, and so on. Well, I think it could be okay for them. First of all, I kind of push back a little bit on the notion that they aren't participants yet, because, of course, AWS, Azure, these are products that are material for these businesses already. We can't ignore that. Now, have they developed AI out to the level that I think everybody is anticipating? I think people are sort of losing the difference essentially between their cloud products, which do depend heavily on NVIDIA GPUs. Let's be honest. I mean, I was a longtime subscriber to AWS, and we were spending quite a lot of money to basically get access to all of that. So you have to separate that from an AI product that's recognizable to the average consumer, something like a Chat GPT. I think that's what everybody thinks is going to fall out of all of this, not recognizing that these companies are already generating billions of dollars off of their cloud stack, which is, a large part of where that NVIDIA money is coming from.
Right, and the consumer side of it may not be the biggest sort of gainer of it all. I mean, it could be the enterprise side of it, which we're not necessarily hearing about at this point. But Tim, let's say the hyperscalers say we're not going to spend as much, and that's a positive for them. Negative for NVIDIA.
Sure. I do think that there's been kind of this dynamic that's driven the NVIDIA numbers and has allowed the street also just to kind of project what it's going to look like next quarter. But I do think it does get back, and I think Google's a good example because they are kind of caught in the middle of this. I think we want to understand what the ROI is on their spend. They as much as anybody. So we want to know what the spend is. We want to know what the ROI is on the spend. And then you get back to their core consumer business. I mean, their core search, which is obviously on some level this dynamic which may be getting threatened, but is still expected to kind of grow. I think the street's at 12.4% on consensus, and that the EPS line is supposed to grow roughly 13.5%. It leads you to a place where Google, of all of these names, I think should be the most defensive, though, based upon the multiple relative to itself. And again, at the EPS where the street is, this is a $200 stock if it's trading at 20 times, and that's something I think is interesting.
Michael, how has the positioning been like into this very big week of earnings?
Bullish pretty much in all of them, actually. Oh, yeah. I mean, well, first of all, look, NVIDIA traded, 4.7 million contracts, over 55 million contracts, including index and ETF options today. But calls are outpacing puts in all of these names, and by a considerable amount. I mean, we're talking about probably 2 times as many upside bets being made. And, I think it's more just a skittishness about the fact that the stocks have come so far, NVIDIA maybe being the most notable example in this, because, I mean, I guess what multiple we assign to this depends a little bit on what you think they're going to do. But I'm looking at maybe $4 a share for full year 2025. So that gets us to 35 times, next calendar year. That doesn't seem overly expensive. That's more than 40% year-on-year growth. So that's PEG ratio less than 1. I mean, that's growth at a reasonable price.
All right, I hope you're all doing great today. The S&P finished the day nearly flat after trading higher earlier in today's session, and NVIDIA finished the day 0.8% higher. Today was the final day of NVIDIA's AI Summit in Mumbai, and now the next AI Summit is scheduled for November 12th and 13th in Tokyo. And Jensen Huang is scheduled to speak at this AI Summit on November 13th. A lot has happened regarding NVIDIA recently, and I want to touch on a few things regarding both NVIDIA and the rest of the market. I will be completely honest with you all. I've been surprised at how well both the market and NVIDIA have held up over the last few weeks. For about a month now, I've been saying that I am cautious about adding to positions in this market until we get to November 1st due to the pattern the market followed back in 2016 and 2020. Back then, the market traded lower in late October, reaching a relative low on the Friday before election week. This year, that would be November 1st. With that in mind, over the past few weeks, NVIDIA has made new all-time highs and the broader market has been holding up well. So I don't know how much of a dip we will get before the election, if any. That being said, I'm personally holding off on adding to swing trade and long-term positions until we get to November 1st, just in case. In the meantime, I've been allocating capital to shorter duration trades, which has allowed me to be more directionally independent, and that's been going great so far. Looking ahead, if we get a dip between now and November 1st, then I would likely use that as a buying opportunity. And if we don't get a dip before the election, then that is fine too. Either way, I am bullish on NVIDIA for the next 1 to 2 years, and I think the market is likely to rally into year-end following the election, as long as nothing unexpected is happening in the world during that time. Now, looking ahead to next week, this one is a bit of a wild card. In fact, I think the next 2 weeks are likely to be volatile because there is so much happening. Next week, we get major earnings from the hyperscalers, and then the following week is the week of the election and the week of the next FOMC meeting. So buckle up for the next 2 weeks. In the immediate short term, I would not be surprised if the market trades lower next week as the pre-election jitters settle in and some market participants de-risk a little bit. If we have some red action in the markets next week, don't freak out because it will most likely be temporary before the market trades higher into year end. Now, if we didn't have mega-cap tech earnings next week, then I would absolutely be expecting the market to trade lower next week. But mega-cap tech earnings are sort of a curveball here. Remember that next week is likely to be volatile. And so if a hyperscaler reports positive earnings next week, then you could see the market trade higher in the short term as the market is juiced up on heightened volatility. At the same time, if any of the hyperscalers report disappointing earnings, then that could cause the market to dip hard in the short term due to the heightened volatility. So don't freak out next week. I'm expecting it to be volatile, and we may get some strong upward swings or strong downward swoons throughout the week due to mega-cap tech earnings during a period of heightened volatility. Now, if the market trades lower next week, and especially if the market trades lower into next Friday, I would most likely use that as a buying opportunity. I was looking at the SPYs chart on the daily time frame today to get a better understanding of what happened back in 2016 and 2020. And I noticed that the week before election week is when the market had its most significant decline right before each election. If we get a dip next week that extends into Friday, then I think that would provide a very attractive buying opportunity on some SPY calls going into the week of the election. I'm not telling you to take that trade. I'm just saying that that is something I'm watching. If we get a dip lasting into Friday of next week, then I would likely buy some SPY calls as a swing trade heading into the week of the election. But again, that's only if we get a dip next week. We have to wait and see if we get a dip first. Now back to NVIDIA. I think NVIDIA is especially likely to start trading higher in early November in anticipation of the company's next earnings report on November 20th. I think this is likely given Micron's great earnings and TSMC's great earnings. Remember that TSMC manufactures NVIDIA's chips. And not only did TSMC post great numbers in their earnings report, but their earnings report also showed signs of quarter-over-quarter revenue growth acceleration. This is such an important concept to grasp. TSMC manufactures NVIDIA's chips. Therefore, if TSMC is seeing revenue growth acceleration, then that means NVIDIA likely is as well. And I find it interesting that this revenue growth acceleration from TSMC is happening at the same time that some of NVIDIA's customers are starting to receive shipments of Blackwell. I wonder if this is the reason for TSMC's quarter-over-quarter revenue growth acceleration. If so, that bodes very well for NVIDIA and for NVIDIA's next earnings report. Regardless of what happens in the short term, I am bullish on the long-term future of NVIDIA, and I genuinely would not be surprised if this company doubles over the next 2 years, given NVIDIA's current growth trajectory and upcoming product cycles. Hyperscalers must invest in AI infrastructure now. The demand for NVIDIA's products is insane. NVIDIA has a massive competitive moat and holistic ecosystem that no competitor is even close to yet, and we have a clear product roadmap from NVIDIA for the next 2 years. This year, we get the launch of Blackwell. Then in 2025, we get Blackwell Ultra, and later on, Rubin is scheduled to arrive in 2026. As long as everything remains peaceful in the Pacific, and as long as none of the hyperscalers significantly reduce their capex spending on AI, then I think NVIDIA should be just fine for at least the next 1 to 2 years. At least that's how I view the situation. With all of that being said, I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. Thank you all so much for watching these videos. I really do appreciate you being here. And with that, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about NVIDIA in the comments below. Please leave a like on this video so more people will see it. And while you're down there, please consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.